Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is Monique Rodriguez Balbuena. I am a professor of comparative literature at the University of Oregon, and currently I'm a Sutherland Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I am very pleased to receive here with us Dr. Yael Aronoff and Dr. Saliba Sarsar, who will speak to us about possible paths to peace in Israel and Palestine. And I have their introduction. So let me say a few words about them. So tonight, we will discuss the legitimacy of both Israeli and Palestinian desires for self-determination and to recognize previous efforts to negotiate peace, helping us to untangle the complex history of the region. Dr. Aronoff is the Michael and Elaine Serling and Friends Endowed Chair in Israel Studies and the director of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel at Michigan State University. She's also a professor of political science at James Madison College at Michigan State University. She's the author of several works, including a co-authored book with Dr. Sarsar, and Peleg, which is called titled Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond, and has many other works. They are listed, in the promotion to this lecture. And Dr. Saliba Sarsar, born and raised in Jerusalem, he's he's professor of political science at Monmouth University. He has several works. He has focused his research on Jerusalem, Palestinian and Israeli relations, the Middle East, and peace building. Some of his works are Jerusalem, the Home in Our Hearts, and Peace Building in Israeli-Palestinian Relations. And of course, as I mentioned, has a co-authored book with Dr. Aronoff. Dr. Sarsar is the recipient of the Award of Academic Excellence from the American Task Force on Palestine, the Humanitarian Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice, and the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation Award. I would like to mention that this event follows the shared principles for educational events on the Israeli-Palestine conflict by the faculty group on such educational events in the Division of Global Engagement at the U of O. And also, I'd like to mention and thank publicly our co-sponsors, who are Academic Engagement Network, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Global Studies and Languages, Global Studies Institute, the UO UNESCO Crossings Institute, and the UNESCO Chair of Transcultural Studies, Interreligious Dialogue, and Peace. The way we are doing this is each speaker will talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. And you are welcome to write your questions that I will receive, and then I will relay to the speakers. So thank you again. And it's my pleasure then to welcome as our first speaker, Dr. Yael Aronoff.
Thank you very much for having us, Dr. Balbuena, and to all the co-sponsors. And it's a real honor and a pleasure to be with my colleague and friend, Dr. Saliba Sarsar. We've been working together for many years and have done several webinars together this year. And it's always an honor to be with you. So thanks so much for doing this with me. It's a extremely heartbreaking situation right now between Israelis and Palestinians when we mourn the deaths of so many thousands of Palestinian civilians, hundreds of Israeli civilians, the over 130 hostages that are still being held in Gaza, the vast majority now of the Palestinian population that's displaced, and several 100,000 Israelis that are internally displaced. And it's an extremely heartbreaking situation that is painful to Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, and Muslims, Arab Americans, and so many others that are intimately involved or watching this. And while there's so many details that could be discussed about the war itself, we're taking kind of a step back and trying to first emphasize the importance of looking at both Israelis and Palestinian civilians with compassion and empathy, and also trying to view the framework as one of and rather than and then or. And so I think especially many young people and students, they almost feel, if they hadn't known much about the conflict previously, that they're kind of being cornered to see, you know, that they have to kind of make a choice whether they're going to support Israeli Palestinians, Israeli civilians, or Palestinian civilians, or Israel or Palestine. And both of us very much think that it's not an or proposition, but rather we can very much support and have compassion for and try to understand and empathize with all civilians in the area, both Israelis and Palestinians. And also recognize thereby that one doesn't always have to make a choice. Often, you know, it's either one is for self-determination for a free Palestine, or one is self-determination for Israelis. And both of us feel very deeply our whole lives that we've supported a Palestinian state alongside Israel in terms of a two-state solution or a confederation based on a two-state solution, so that we can respect both people's indigeneity in the region and both people's desires for self-determination. And so in doing that, we're going to look a little bit historically how using this framework can one can try to empathize with both. And then we're going to be looking at some previous attempts at peace negotiations and maybe some of the things that we need to look towards when this situation hopefully ends as quickly as possible, and a ceasefire, hostage release, and so forth, where we can then move towards really a meaningful, more long-lasting peace agreement that would afford a Palestinian state next to an Israeli state, and what kinds of things we can look forward to in this very bleak situation in terms of the future. So one of the reasons that we're using this framework is that often when one has to choose one side, there's a tendency to demonize one side and versus the other, or we have this kind of cognitive dissonance in trying to avoid reconsidering assumptions or looking at facts that don't support what we already think or that complicate it. And we tend to ignore those things or question their credibility. And we tend to therefore oversimplify things at times, especially when we're all getting information, or I'm not on social media, but many people are getting information on social media where they become echo chambers of a kind of oversimplified story that one can get through social media. And then there's a sense of treating Israelis in a monolithic way when there's so many divisions within Israelis. And so, and it's such a polarized society, which is why it had 5 elections in the past 4 years, as well as with Palestinians. There's so many different points of view and perspectives and groups and parties that we don't want to oversimplify things and treat Israelis or Palestinians in a monolithic way, but rather look at some of the divisions and different perspectives within them. So I think, if we look at something like indigeneity, I think we want to accept how Palestinians, without challenging it in any way, shape, or form, are indigenous to the area and have been there for hundreds, if not several thousand years. And that nationalism really grew alongside Jewish nationalism or Zionism in a very similar time in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where both peoples maybe had multiple identities. The idea of nationalism and that each people deserves their own nation state, which became so popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is something that also deepened with both Palestinians and Jewish Israelis at the time. So I think we want to support and not question Palestinian indigeneity, and the same thing for Jewish indigeneity, where Jews have been there for 3,000 years. They had in 900 BCE the first temple for 410 years under King Solomon, and when that was destroyed and many Jews were expelled by Babylon, they then came back and rebuilt a temple for another 420 years that was destroyed in 70 CE, and then you had some continuous Jewish presence, even though most were expelled, that were in Jerusalem and Tzfat and other places. And now, of course, you have some Jewish Israelis who have been there for 20 generations, some for 4 generations. 80% of Jewish Israelis were born in Israel. So I think everyone has to make up their minds about different politics and different solutions, but we may not want to start, we may want to start from a position that doesn't deny either party indigeneity. And as my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarsar, always says, they're both going to be there and continue to be there, and no one is going anywhere. And I think when we look over the past year, in that vein, there's been a lot of not only looking at the current war, but going back to 1948 and whether, and then not only supporting the establishment of a Palestinian state, which I've deeply supported my entire life, as has Dr. Sarsar, but questioning the existence now of Israel and its establishment in 1948. And so I would just suggest, and everyone is going to make, of course, their own opinions and should read more and learn from different perspectives. But again, trying to think of a framework that does not necessarily looking at one state instead of another, which is the current Netanyahu's government stance, by the way, as well, that they are opposed to a Palestinian state. And as Hamas's vision as well, that they're opposed to an Israeli state and want a Palestinian state instead of Israel, but rather adopt a framework where we might be able to hold simultaneously, right, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, which has been accepted, by the way, by the Arab League and the Palestinian Authority and previous Israeli governments, and the UN and the EU and the United States and Russia. So when we look back at 1948, we might look at, many facts that have happened and not necessarily select only those that support Jewish Israelis or only those that support Palestinians, but rather look at the complexity at that time, right? So, of course, Jewish Israelis, or many would point to the fact that the UN in its the UN General Assembly in 1947 was advocating for and voted for a Jewish state alongside an Arab state. And that was accepted by the Jewish Zionists at the time, the majority of Jews living there at the time. And it was rejected by the Palestinian leadership. And I always tell people that we don't want to if we really want to come to a true understanding and move constructively forward, the blame game is not constructive, and we should always put in each stage put ourselves in Jewish Israeli shoes and Palestinian shoes. And so, for instance, one can understand perhaps why Palestinians would reject it, why give part of the land when they think they could get all of it, or when they could have the Arab states support them and they possibly could win and wouldn't need to compromise. So I think one can look at that with understanding, but also look with understanding at Jewish Israelis that they didn't, come in to colonize, so to speak, in the sense that they weren't coming from other countries in order to get resources and bring back to the other countries. They were actually had been persecuted and expelled from other countries and were also indigenous to the area. And you can look at what occurred afterwards, and in which for Israelis who thought they might lose the war, as 50% of its relatively weak military at that point thought, and thought that, at best they would be conquered or ethnically expelled, at worst massacred, in terms of some of the things that have been said on the part of the Arab states that attacked it in 1948, as well as the Palestinian leadership, and empathize, I think, with the plight that Jewish Israelis would be in had they lost the war, and 1% were killed during the war, including Holocaust survivors. And I think one could try to empathize with that, as well as empathize that for Palestinians, it was a catastrophe. It was the Nakba, in that 750,000 people were left, and it was a catastrophe. It seems like, from the scholarship that I've seen from Benny Miller and others, that 150,000 were forced out by Israeli military commanders on the ground, and the other 600,000 left, and not voluntarily, not because that you want to leave your home, but because they thought the Arab states would win the war and they would be able to come back in a couple of weeks. And it was a devastating situation for Palestinians. So I think you can look at 1948 and I think try to empathize in some ways with both people's desires and the effects of them as well. And you can do that with the 67 war too. You could look at how the Soviet Union, played a role in kind of a war that neither Israel nor Jordan nor Egypt wanted, and stirring things up, falsely telling Syria that Israel was going to invade, which caused Nasser to tell the UN to withdraw. And we don't have time to go into the details, but in a sense, it was a war no one initially wanted, and try to look at the complexities of that. And after the war, that Israel had offered to give the West Bank back to Jordan, who had occupied it, and Gaza back to, and Sinai back to Egypt, that occupied it. And the Arab League at the time said no negotiations with Israel, no recognition with Israel, and there weren't negotiations. So on one hand, you have, again, another catastrophe for Palestinians, in that they're living under occupation after 67 in the West Bank and Gaza, but also looking at the fact that Israel didn't necessarily want this war either, thought it would have huge repercussions from it. And after the war, initially was willing to trade that land for peace agreements with its neighbors. Of course, over time, you got some among Israelis and religious settlers who then wanted to take advantage of the situation and make facts on the ground and have Israel keep that land that some Israelis had longed for initially, while others had been perfectly happy to live within the 67 borders before the war. So I think if we then move ahead to some previous efforts to negotiate an Israeli-Palestinian deal, and there have been so many, right? It initially started in the early 1990s with the Oslo Accords, and it was the first time that Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized each other and wanted to have a process that would build trust and lead toward a two-state solution. Initially, that trust was being built by Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, the PLO chairman, who had returned to the West Bank and was elected with a big mandate. Initially, some progress was made, and there were spoilers on both sides that did not believe in a two-state solution and tried to undermine it. On the Israeli side, you had right-wingers and settlers who wanted to didn't necessarily want to move towards a two-state solution, which is why Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in November 1995 by such a religious settler. And on the other hand, you had Hamas at the time that was starting more suicide bombings in Israel because it was against the Oslo process and against a two-state solution, which was also undermining the trust rather than in a two-state solution and undermining support for it. And that actually led to Netanyahu's being initially elected in 1996 by just a few thousand votes. And he, started stalling also and delaying some of the commitments in the Oslo process. Those desires for negotiation were rekindled in 2000 in the Camp David negotiations that Bill Clinton oversaw. A lot of progress was made in those negotiations in the sense that Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister Barak, was voted by, in Israeli terms, a landslide in 2000 to really implement what Yitzhak Rabin had started. And he was going to try to get to a peace agreement within a year and establish a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and was the first prime minister to try to negotiate the fact that most of East Jerusalem would become part of a capital of the new Palestinian state, or Al-Quds. There are a lot of complications, including and blame that can go around to different parties, which I don't have time to discuss now, but we're happy in question and answers as to why they weren't able to reach an agreement. But then again, we had a period of 5 years of violence during the Second Intifada, where Hamas and others had weekly suicide bombings inside Israel against civilians. Israel was then going into territories trying to get people who had they thought were planning or instigating it. Civilians also were killed in the process, and over 3,000 Palestinians were killed, and over 1,000 Jewish Israeli were killed during this period. And even during this period of violence, negotiations continued. We had other negotiations in Taba in 2001. And then in 2008, after the Second Intifada ended in 2005, and when Israel evacuated all its settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip in 2005, there was another period of negotiations in 2008 where Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert also got very closer after thousands of hours of negotiations and so many meetings. By the way, Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, the current leader of the Fatah party and the Palestinian Authority, came to Olmert's house, and Olmert had a big Palestinian flag in his house to welcome Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas. And there they offered almost 94% of the West Bank, all of Gaza, and then a swap of the almost 6% of pre-1967 territory that would be part of the new Palestinian state. If Israel were to keep 4% of the West Bank, because some of the bigger settlements near Jerusalem are in that 4%, it would need to give back an equivalent in terms of valuable and amount of land to a Palestinian state. And there would be free passage and a tunnel between the West Bank and Gaza. There would be a capital in most of East Jerusalem of Al-Quds. And there would be, this was according to the Clinton parameters as well, that there would be a curb on the implementation of a right of return of refugees to Israel, that most refugees would come to the new Palestinian state, and far fewer numbers would be accepted by Israel to come into Israel, and there would be billions of dollars of compensation for lost property and asylum in different countries and so forth. And it seemed like Saeb Erekat and others who are negotiating on the part of the Palestinian Authority, and perhaps Mahmoud Abbas himself, were willing to kind of curb the implementation of, in that way, the right of return. And so they were becoming much closer to negotiations. And tragically, that didn't come about. And I think often when we don't reach peace agreements, it can be harmful, I think, to demonize Mahmoud Abbas or Palestinians for not agreeing to something or continue to negotiate, or demonizing Israelis, and rather look at the real deep progress that was made, that this is actually very doable. And at different periods, and in most periods, a plurality of Israelis and Palestinians actually supported getting to a two-state solution, and in some cases still do. And therefore, we want to look at, I think, that rather than playing the blame game, trying to understand that often, unfortunately, there'll be different actors who'll be like, okay, Mahmoud Abbas might think I might get a better deal if a different American president elected, if Obama's elected, or Olmert is not very popular in Israel right now. And if we're trying to stand in Mahmoud Abbas's shoes, so fears about whether Israel would eventually implement it, or on Israeli side as well, and trying to understand Israelis then, when both populations are disillusioned, that they are told by their leaders and by American leaders that they have given generous offers for a Palestinian state alongside Israel. And therefore, when those things are turned down, you have sometimes a shift to the right in Israel because it's turned down, and then there's violence and other things. So I think our framework is asking you or others to try to step both into Israeli shoes, try to step into Palestinian shoes, and rather than demonize, which is what we do in psychology in terms of the attribution area, we blame someone's character as opposed to the context they may be in, and try to understand the context, that this is not a deterministic thing, that Israelis will or Palestinians will act a certain way, but try to look at the conditions under which they're operating and look at how that might change, right? And so if we look at the current situation, which we're not delving deeply into because we want to look back and forward, you'd want to look to perhaps an end to the war, an end to this as soon as possible, with a ceasefire and hostage release, perhaps, and then Israel getting out as soon as possible with then Arab League and Palestinian Authority or other Arab states coming in for a temporary managing of reconstruction in Gaza before you can get kind of elections among Palestinians that would be able to move forward in a way where, of course, Palestinians are governing themselves as soon as possible and moving towards that Palestinian state alongside Israel. And so if we look at some of the things that we will need to get there, one of the things for sure is a new leadership on both the Israeli and Palestinian side. So if we look at the Israeli side, the current government that was established and put together in December 2022 is the most right-wing and religious government Israel's ever had. And unlike several previous governments, as I've just quickly glossed through, who some of whom were elected on the basis of reaching a two-state solution within a year, as was Ehud Barak, and were ready to do that, even though they were flawed and also made mistakes themselves, the current government is opposed to the framework that we're using, as is Hamas. But if we want to look for signs of hope in Israel, well, the current polls from just the past couple of weeks, the Likud party of Netanyahu keeps losing potential mandates if there was a current election today. And today they would only get 17, whereas Benny Gantz's more centrist National Unity Party is gaining. And if there were elections today, the current coalition would drop to 47 seats. You need over 60 in Israel's 120 seats in the parliament. And then the opposition would get 64 seats. So a lot of Israelis, the most recent polls say 58% of Israelis think Netanyahu should resign immediately. Most Israelis also, give him blame, obviously Hamas to blame, but Netanyahu to blame for a variety things of not being ready and distracting the country and so forth in terms of the attacks on October 7th. And many Israelis are demonstrating in the streets to prioritize a deal for hostages and to have as early elections as possible. And many Israelis don't want Netanyahu to serve out his term, but rather call for new elections. And so there is hope. I mean, unfortunately, it's not happening as quickly as maybe some of us would like, but there is hope for definitely a new government that could make progress towards reestablishing a path towards a two-state solution and a Palestinian state that could make things better. And if we also looked on the Palestinian side in terms of their polling, and even though it is more difficult in today's Gaza to do that polling, there's a very wonderful polling that's being done, and the latest was in March, and they did it in 14 different places in Gaza that it could be done. And in there, you also have some findings that are interesting to note. And that one finding is support for a two-state solution among Palestinians has increased significantly over the past 3 months, at least until March. And especially in the Gaza Strip, there's a 27-point increase. And so there's about a 45% support for a two-state solution. And if we look at the extremely heartbreaking situation in Gaza right now, it really is amazing in some ways, right? That we have half the population essentially saying, yes, we would support a two-state solution alongside Israel. And often that's plurality more than any other singular alternative that is presented. Also, it's interesting to see, like in Israel, where you have so much dissatisfaction with Netanyahu, you also have over 80% of Palestinians saying that Mahmoud Abbas should resign. He's in his late 80s, and there's time for looking at new leadership and new elections at some point. And poll after poll shows that Marwan Barghouti would be the most popular Palestinian leader. And that has also risen, by the way, just in the last 3 months. The difference between people who would support Marwan Barghouti of the Fatah party is almost 2-to-1, as it would be if Hamas and Marwan Barghouti was Hania. There was an election with Hania opposed to Barghouti. Barghouti has been in an Israeli jail since the Second Intifada. There was a lot of evidence showing that he had planned and participated in attack that targeted civilians inside Israel. But if there were going to be an exchange of prisoners in a deal, I think it would be there potentially could be a lot of positive for him being released as part of that deal, because even though it would be difficult for many Israelis, given the fact that he had supported targeting civilians in Israel, he, at least from the information I know, and for many years, he still has also supported a two-state solution. And therefore, you'd have someone who has the legitimacy among Palestinians to actually make accommodations that would be necessary and bring the people towards that. And with Israel, too, you might have a centrist like Gantz, who is not as much on the left in terms of marching towards a two-state solution as urgently as possible, yet he might have the military credentials and prestige in Israel to actually carry the population forward. So here we could have two figures that could actually have the legitimacy within their own countries with the support. And we do, and I'll end with this now, we do have another avenue with the Saudi Arabia and the US coming closer and closer to having a defense pact, and Saudi Arabia being in a position where it's saying, you know, we want to expand this coalition if only Israel will free settlements in the West Bank, get out of Gaza, and get, you know, others to control it in terms of the PA and other Arab states, and then have a 3 to 5 year path towards Palestinian statehood alongside Israel. Israel could be part and the Palestine could be part of a coalition together, actually, with Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Morocco, and the US, and some European countries and others, that could provide an incentive if we had a different Israeli leadership currently and a different Palestinian leadership. So we're happy to answer questions, and I defer to you. Dr. Sarsar is far more eloquent than me, and he also ends with a very powerful poem. So I think
Thank you.
you'll find it very moving to hear from him.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yael Aronoff. Wonderful to be with you. And a great thank you to Dr. Monique Balbuena for organizing this webinar. Let me start by sharing with you a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in East Jerusalem in an all-Muslim neighborhood. We lived about a few hundred yards from no man's land. On one side was Jordan, where I lived. On the other side was Israel. At age 11, the Six-Day War took place, and the second day, after very intense fighting, we had to leave our home. And as we were leaving, just going down a little bit in the valley side, we got separated. An older brother and I got separated from the rest of our family. And we didn't know what happened to them. They didn't know what happened to us. It took us several days to be reunited. Upon our return, we found out that two of our immediate neighbors were killed during that war. And you cannot imagine the pain, the sorrow, what we have gone through, a battle for Jerusalem, loss of neighbors. And I cannot imagine what the people of Gaza are feeling today, what the people of Israel felt on October 7th and since then. It is an unbelievable, unacceptable situation. And what I'm suggesting to you there is that this conflict has been going on for decades and decades, and enough is enough. Israeli-Palestinian relations are at a crucial juncture, and this year marks the 76th anniversary of the 48 war, the 57th anniversary of the Six-Day War, the 31st anniversary of the Oslo Accords of September 93. And after all these years of diplomatic inertia, extremism, and ultranationalism, these are on the rise, with violence often spiraling out of control, as expressed in the Hamas attack on October 7th, during which 1,139 Israelis were killed and over 248 hostages were taken, and the subsequent Israel-Hamas war, which we are witnessing in its 7th month. What we know is that thus far, over 35,000 Palestinians have been killed and over 78,000 have been wounded, with 48% of them being women and children, as well as the destruction of countless housing units and the internal displacement of over 85% of the 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. This is in addition to the wounding of 8,730 Israelis and the internal displacement of Israeli citizens from the areas close to the Gaza Strip and to the north, the border with Lebanon. Now, 81% of the Gaza inhabitants are descendants of Palestinian refugees from the 48 war, which witnessed the partition plan and the ending of the British mandate, the establishment of the State of Israel, and then the 48 war, which the Palestinians and some others called the Nakba, or catastrophe. And for 19 years, that is between 1948 war and 1967 war, Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip while Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The control of these territories passed on to Israel after it won the Six-Day War. And over the succeeding years, Israel built in the Gaza Strip 21 settlements, which it evacuated in 2005. Moreover, it imposed restrictions on the movement of people and goods to and from the Gaza Strip, which date to 1991 and which have become more severe after 2000. Now, Israel and Hamas, as you probably know, have fought each other before, specifically in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2018 in terms of the mass protest of Palestinians in Gaza on the border with Israel, 2021 and 2023-24, which we're going through today. And so I calculated all these figures, and they might be off by very little, but essentially, thus far, the confrontation between Israel and Hamas over all these years have cost the lives of 39,000 plus Palestinians, wounding of 114,000 Palestinians, the killing of 1,234 Israelis, and the wounding of over 10,000 Israelis. Now, when we compare these figures, or even just the ongoing conflict, to the 1967 war, in 1967, 18,300 Palestinians or Arabs were killed. In contrast to Israelis, 793 Israelis were killed and 4,517 wounded. Now, I don't need to remind you that every single life, no matter who it is a precious life, and we have no right to take that life away. And so my presentation brings in the personal background, having survived the Six-Day War, with my professional background, as you will tell in a few minutes. Now, the history of pain and unfulfilled expectations, the casualties, the refugees, the dispossessed, the distrust, the lack of vision and political horizon make peaceful and secure coexistence truly difficult. Israelis and Palestinians have become victims of their own exclusive national narratives and are speaking past each other. Many on each side are unable to go beyond their own zero-sum mentality. They selectively highlight the rightness of their cause, accuse the other of bad intentions or misconduct, and fail to realize how their own rhetoric and acts cause aggravating conditions. The status quo is untenable. Much is at stake, and indecision is costly for all concerned. And it is not enough to transform the public discourse on Israel-Palestine. It is also not enough to wish for new leaders when there are none on the horizon with vision for a better tomorrow. And maybe, as Dr. Aronoff has mentioned a few names, it is very difficult for these personalities to really take the step forward to make that happen. While the obstacles in the way of progress to peace are numerous and real, such as power imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians, one-state reality with Israel dominant over the Palestinians, the hardening of attitudes in Israel and Palestine, the relative weakness of the Israeli and Palestinian peace camp, Israeli settler radicalization, Palestinian anti-normalization campaign, terrorism, these must not delay or prevent the search for opportunities and positive outcomes. In this regard, there are simple facts that present themselves. They are so simple that we often ignore them. Number one, Israelis and Palestinians are neighbors forever. Their present and future are intertwined, whether they acknowledge this reality or not. Number two, the longer Israelis and Palestinians wait to negotiate, the more complicated the issues become and the less room there will be for a peaceful solution. Number three, the core issues that separate Israelis and Palestinians from each other, such as borders, the separation wall, security, Israeli settlements, Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem, fresh water, are well known, thoroughly debated, and resolvable. The challenge is to initiate negotiations and negotiate in good faith. Number 4, the inclusion of regional and international actors becomes key as peace requires assurance, follow-up, and support to take root and grow. Number 5, Israelis and Palestinians have proved to be incapable and unwilling to restart negotiations on their own. The U.S. thus must go beyond managing the conflict to taking the lead to break the deadlock. It possesses the essential capabilities to move both negotiating parties to take the necessary political risks by compromising and engaging in unavoidable trade-offs on the path to peace. If past negotiations are any indication, there is middle ground between the positions of Israel and the Palestinians. Now, the prerequisites for peacemaking are known, including the context and timing, the leadership and political will, societal strength and resilience, the process, and the content and creativity. All of these are known. U.S. diplomacy must be credible, intentional, sustained, and transformative. This comprises not only making peace a priority, but also acting accordingly. This situation on the ground must change, and a realistic plan and process of peacemaking must be launched, and Israelis and Palestinians must be held accountable for their actions and inactions. The strategic interest of Egypt and Jordan that have peace treaties with Israel, of Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan that are party to the Abraham Accords, and of Saudi Arabia that is entertaining normalized relations with Israel should impel them to motivate Palestinians to make hard decisions for ending the conflict and peace. Israel needs to reciprocate. Circumventing the Palestinian issue or wishing it away will not advance Israel's strategic goals, especially in the long run. Initiating unilateral moves and thinking of the Palestinian issue as a security matter only, without addressing its political and territorial dimensions, will not enhance Israel's defense. If anything, they will continue to rile the Palestinians, particularly the youth among them, and could potentially lead to more bloodshed. Israel and Palestine and their respective supporters should realize that maximal nationalist demands of full dominance by one over the other, or the incorporation of both Israelis and Palestinians in a single democratic state at this time, no matter how attractive it is, will only lead to a dead end. Peace necessitates that Israel and Palestine do their utmost and judicially expect less than they hope for. As Hussein Ibish, a colleague and a co-author, writes, the one-state agenda is not viable. Why? Among the reasons are, number 1, the creation of a single Palestinian-Israeli state is not possible given existing international and regional power equations. Number 2, the one-state rhetoric lets Israel off the hook on occupation and settlements. Number 3, the one-state agenda has no significant political base among either Palestinians or Israelis. Number 4, the one-state agenda has no basis in international law which favors two states. Number 5, the one-state agenda typically offers nothing to Jewish Israelis. In contrast, the two-state solution calling for Israel and Palestine to live alongside each other in security, peace, and prosperity has been the official U.S. policy since 2002. Even though many think it has become increasingly less viable, it is the most reasonable and logical plan that will enable the Palestinians to advance their search for freedom, independence, and statehood without being anti-Israel, and that will enable Israelis to have their security and well-being without being anti-Palestinian. Now, let me interject here just a little bit by saying I am in favor of a Palestine, maybe different from what many Palestinians believe, but I favor a Palestine that is pluralistic, democratic, non-militarized, and to be a positive stabilizing regional power. This is to be chosen by the Palestinian people out of their own volition as opposed to be imposed by them. It makes most sense for their investments, their attention, their energies to be put into creating a society and enhancing it in such a way that will focus internally in developing its economy, its culture, its society in so many ways. And being pluralistic, democratic, non-militarized will enable that to happen and will make Palestine shine in cooperation with regional powers, including Israel. The US should urge Israel and the Palestinians to put on their agenda the idea of confederation, which adjusts or introduces important modification to the classical two-state solution. This confederal idea is not to totally separate the two peoples, that is divorce, but to empower them to cohabitate in two respective sovereign states. This would allow for greater cooperation and movement between them. The initial step would be to negotiate a permanent agreement and establish an independent Palestinian state without the confederal umbrella. An implementation period of up to 30 months would follow. Palestine and Israel would live side by side as sovereign states, and only at the end of the implementation period, they would form a confederation between them, if they wanted it. Upon the signing of the permanent agreement, Israel will officially recognize the Palestinian state, and the government of the new state will become Israel's partner for all the arrangements toward the full implementation of the agreement. If during the period of implementation there is a decision by one or both states to give up on the confederation idea, then the two states will renegotiate parts of the agreement which stem from the idea of confederation. While both Palestinians and Israelis fear that a confederation may serve the other's hidden agenda, a confederation has important benefits. Let me just mention a couple of them. The entire area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is small. The partition borders are largely artificial. A permeable border would be beneficial to both Israel and Palestine. Number two, a confederal solution may mitigate the unavoidable price of partition and reduce ethnocentric tendency. Partition accompanied by a commitment to cooperation and coordination may help to allay fears that relinquishing sovereignty or direct rule over a certain part of land will make it inaccessible. Unlike the status quo or the one-state solution, the confederal solution offers a horizon for the long-term realization of both mainstream Zionist vision and ethos and Palestinian mainstream aspirations for national self-determination in an independent sovereign nation state. Palestine and Israel share a vital interest in addressing various common issues, including internal security, border defense, planning, zoning, public health, the use of natural resources, ecological challenges, tourism, and yes, criminal matters. Lastly, a confederal solution would establish Jerusalem as a partially open city to be extended later. The old city of Jerusalem could host some of the joint authorities, paving the way towards dual sovereignty or some other creative solution over this sensitive area. Ultimately, the hope is that the confederation between Israel and Palestine will have permeable borders, freedom of movement for people and goods, joint political institutions parallel to the separate state institutions, and the residents of the confederation will feel that they live in one framework. If the parties decide to step back, it will not become irreversible. And if they decide to proceed quickly toward more proximity between them, no article in the peace agreement will restrain them. Now, my own family, like countless other families, experience Ottoman, British, Jordanian, Israeli rule. each with its own challenges and uncertainty. They lived through the Arab-Israeli struggles of the British Mandate, several Arab-Israeli wars, 2 Palestinian intifadas, and many cycles of violence. In such an environment, we become hostage to and victim of fear and insecurity. There are better ways to solve and resolve conflict than through violence. Violence is not a path toward peace. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So it is vital that Israelis and Palestinians change their ways. Crossing the border physically and psychologically is possible. Now, I have many examples. Just let me tell you that Jordan's King Hussein, on June the 5th, 1967, when I heard him, his voice emanating throughout the quarter where I lived, asked his citizens to fight the enemy, Israelis, wherever you find them. However, close to his deathbed, he pleaded for peace during the Wye River Middle East Conference at the signing of the resultant Wye Memorandum in Washington, D.C. on October 23, 1998. He said, "We quarrel, we agree, we are friendly, we are not friendly, but we have no right to dictate through irresponsible action or narrow-mindedness the future of our children and their children's children. There has been enough destruction, enough death, enough waste, and it's time that together we occupy a place beyond ourselves, our peoples, that is worthy of them under the sun, the descendants of the children of Abraham." Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who dedicated his life to defense and security of Israel and who fought hard against Palestinians, such as during the First Intifada, had a change of heart in his Knesset Israeli parliament speech on September 21st, 1993, 8 days after signing the Oslo Accords at the White House lawn. He stated, "This government has decided to try to put an end to hatred in order that our children and grandchildren will not experience the painful price of wars, terrorism, and violence. This government has decided to safeguard their lives and security, to ease the sorrow and the painful memories, to pray and hope for peace." On November 4th, 1995, Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing religious settler fanatic at a major peaceful rally. The assassin's motive to stop the peace process. What I believe what happened with Anwar Sadat, he worked so hard for peace for several years. He got assassinated on October 6, 1981. Rabin got assassinated. Hussein at his deathbed. It's just so tragic that these leaders did not fulfill and have the opportunity to fulfill their dream. Now, on a hopeful sign, if you'll allow me, just on April 11th, just a couple of days in terms of a month ago, April 11th, something special happened in Israel. Dr. Muna Maroon, who is a Maronite Christian Arab Israeli, she was appointed as the rector or president of the University of Haifa. This is the first time that this has happened. This 54-year-old neuroscientist is now leading one of the most prestigious Israeli universities. She explained that her expertise in trauma and brain, as well as her background, have led her to develop a particular sensitivity towards others and to seek paths of dialogue and reconciliation. She stated, "In order to overcome the trauma, we need time, we need rehabilitation, and we need reconciliation between the two sides." She said, "I do believe that with time, we can reconcile and start to establish bridges of empathy, of understanding, and of containing that emotions of each other. After all, we are neighbors and we are living side by side, and I believe and pray that it's about time that kids from both sides will grow up to have dreams and maybe fulfill their dreams through higher education. That's very encouraging news in my book. I know it is extremely hard to think of the future during tragedy and trauma and hopelessness, but we must try if we want to exit the valley of death. It behooves Israelis and Palestinians to work jointly in support of each other's rights. It behooves them to impress upon their leaders to be empathetic with the other and to rise above ideology, party politics, national identity, and religious affiliation. Is not the main goal to advance and advocate for all citizens equally, to manage needs, to resolve conflict, to create social justice, peace, and prosperity? True peace comes to Israelis and Palestinians when they prepare for it. Their children deserve a better tomorrow than today or yesterday. If peace does not embrace them, who or what will it embrace? If not now, when? It is time that Israelis and Palestinians contribute to the mosaic that is the Holy Land, that is peace. If they do not do so with faith, hope, and resilience, then there will be, if they do so with faith, hope, and resilience, then they will be the better for it. Ultimately, their collective action will imbue the Holy Land and beyond with care and compassion and set the dove of peace free. Now, let me read my poem to conclude. This poem is inspired by Psalm 137, and I call it Psalm of Peace. And it consists of two stanzas. The first is the negative, the latter is the positive, reflecting my presentation. By the river Jordan, there we met and there we sobbed when we reflected on the senseless conflict that has beset the Holy Land for generations. When we thought of the children, women, and men, the innocent, who were killed, wounded, and imprisoned. When we witnessed the destruction of dreams and hopes, of the spirit and soul on the altar of exclusion, exclusivity, and extremism, on the twisted agendas of expansionism and political expediency. When will we overcome the urge to aggress, to cause more bloodshed, pain, and tears? Where have our compassion and moral compass gone? Why are universal rights and the rule of law ignored? It is time that we together stand in the middle of the sacred river to confess our wrongs, to acknowledge our responsibility, to commit to healing the world. It's time that we together listen to the call of wisdom. You're in your cherished home, you're in your shared promised land. Let the dove of peace guide your straight path toward dignity, equality, goodwill, justice, and reconciliation. If you sow peace well, you shall reap it well. Your children and children's children deserve it and expect nothing less. That's your common destination. That's your common destiny. And that is the dream and the vision we seek. That is the soul and spirit of the Holy Land, of Eretz Israel, of Palestine. Shalom, salam, peace. Thank you very much.
I think Monique is going to give us some of the questions, or
Yes, I was
okay.
trying to get the video here.
Yeah.
But I can start with some questions. So first of all, thank you so much for your presentations. I had here one of the first questions was actually is one of those, a comment with a question, but it's an interesting one because it's a student. who says that this event was advertised on the Religious Studies Department message board on the 3rd floor on a building on campus, but not in the Students' Union, that the Multicultural Center has nothing on it. So, but there is a lot of propaganda, agitprop, about Zionists off campus and things from JVP, etc. So the question after, this statement of the state of affairs on campus, the student asks, are there more students here? Where are the students? And why is peace so unpopular? And why is war so attractive? That's one question. Let's see, we have several comments. Sincere thank you for a beautiful presentation. Thank you. And I do not believe we ought to rise above our national identity, but to have that identity alongside others. It's still possible to have a confederation with this in mind. Thank you, etc. There is a question about how peace would look like for hold on, I'm really trying to get the camera here, but I don't think I'm gonna get this. I took so that I would get out of the picture, but now I'm out. How peace would look like with the current right-wing religious fundamentalist in power in Israel. And let's see.
I was also seeing some of the questions. Maybe I can try to answer a couple, and I don't know if you can see any,
Yes.
Saliba, and you can answer a couple. So I saw that there was one on kind of the British, role and historically, and then there was a couple questions on Israeli settlements and what would happen to those in a peace agreement, since there's just a couple. I haven't seen all of them because so many are popping up that I can maybe address quickly, and I don't know if Saliba, you can see a couple that you might want to answer as you go through. So in terms of the initial question about the British role, certainly Jewish Israelis and Palestinians both deeply resented the British. So first, unlike, again, the vast majority of Americans, let's say, who came to the United States and had no indigenous historical place in the United States. Jews, of course, did, and Jews already lived in Jerusalem and Sfat and other places before the British ever arrived, and some had lived there continuously for hundreds of years. So that's unlike, let's say, the situation in the United States or Australia or New Zealand or others. Secondly, the reason the Jewish Israelis, they didn't really militarily help Israel. Israel hardly had any military, had a very ragtag military, wasn't getting support from practically anybody. And the only reason it won the war is they thought they'd be killed if they lost. And Egypt was also diverted in Yemen and weren't necessarily using all their forces, and etc. So it's not as if Israel had this really backed military by other powers in 1948. Also, Britain with the 39 white paper was obstructing any Jewish immigration to Palestine. So people who were fleeing the Holocaust were turned back by Britain to their deaths in Europe. And so certainly Britain was no friend or wasn't perceived as any friend of Jews at the time or Jewish Israelis. It was quite the opposite, where there are estimates that up to 1 million of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust were because Britain wouldn't let them into Palestine, and of course hardly any other countries in the world would either. In terms of the Israeli settlements, certainly it is an obstacle to reaching a two-state solution, but it's not an insurmountable obstacle. So most of the settlers, as opposed to most of the settlements, are living in 3 or 4 settlements right near Jerusalem. And those under previous peace negotiations would be part of the 2 to 3 or 4% of the West Bank that Israel would keep, and then it would swap an equal valuable territory to the Palestinian state. So in a sense, under previous sets of negotiations, and by the way, the Palestinian Authority was, Mahmoud Abbas has said publicly many times that Israel could keep 1.9% or 2% of the West Bank, and in doing so, it would allow most of the settlers to actually be in the new Israel's new border. So the Palestinian Authority has agreed to that. And since I think 2016, the Arab League has agreed to the border being on 67 with swaps. So in a sense, most of the settlers would not have to leave. Most of the settlers would be in the 2 to 4% of the West Bank that Israel could keep with swaps of that territory. So it could be equivalent to 100% of the West Bank and Gaza and most of East Jerusalem. And so in that sense, you would have, though, many settlements in the West Bank that some of them have 100 people, some of them have 500 people or 1,000 people that would need to be evacuated. In previous surveys, even though people wouldn't necessarily want to leave, the vast majority would leave if they were commanded to leave by Israel. And at least at certain points, it was only 4% that would turn to violence to object to that. So I do think that it could be done as it was done in Gaza, where those 8,000 settlers moved back to Israel. Under a confederation that Dr. Sarsar and others have worked on, some of those settlers could stay and become, and you'd have Palestinians living in Israel who have Palestinian citizenship to the Palestinian state, and Jews living in Palestine who'd have, there'd be kind of more room for not all the settlers having to leave under some scenarios of a confederation. So those are just two things that I could address, and maybe you take a couple, Dr. Sarsar, and then we can move to others. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just comment on the issue of settlements, as was asked. I do not believe that an Israeli prime minister or government will stay in power if they forcefully remove the settlements. That's just my understanding of the Israeli society and Israeli government structure. However, under a confederal system, there will be negotiations. Negotiations will be over, first, the refugees, and Israel will allow a certain number of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes in Israel proper. Now, in terms of the settlements, Jewish settlers will be given a choice to say, we have an agreement, there will be a Palestinian state. Do you want to stay living in a Palestinian state? Let's say out of the 600,000 who live there, only 200,000 will remain. Then Palestine will bring into Israel proper an equivalent number of Palestinians to live in Israel proper. There are multiple ways for confederation. There are at least 12, if not more, confederation plans. I'm talking about what is called the Holy Land Confederation, which says that if settlers wish to stay there, an equivalent number of Palestinians will be agreed upon that will move to become residents of the state of Israel, just as the Jews will remain residents of the state of Palestine. And each of them will vote in their sovereign state, the Palestinians in Palestine, the Israelis in Israel. So this is one way. The suggestion here is not to be locked down. The suggestion is we need to be creative. We are in a land that is no larger than New Jersey. And if we do not work together to make this happen for both peoples, it's not going to happen at all. No occupation is a good occupation. That has to end. A state of Israel has to feel secure. A state of Palestine has to be independent and sovereign. And both living side by side can really create miracles, which they deserve for a long time.
I could maybe take it. There's a couple more that I read, Dr. Balbuena, that I could take, unless there's certain ones that you'd want us to address, or I think you're muted. Yeah.
Pardon. Please take whatever you'd like.
Okay. Yeah, so I saw a couple again saying, oh, aren't there obstacles to a two-state, one on the Israeli side, one on the Palestinian side, I saw in terms of the question. So one was, about Smotrich, who's a real extremist, and, how could we, get to two states if Israelis are supporting him? And on the flip side, how, given what happened on October 7th, there was a kind of a question, like how would Israelis concede to two states now, when it could be that Hamas would take over and eventually things like that. So I'll just address those quickly. First, as many of you know, Israel is a parliamentary democracy. So and there's about 12 different political parties who are often serious contenders to be in the parliament. And so no prime minister has ever gotten a majority vote, as in the United States. So even Prime Minister Netanyahu often has never gotten more than 30% of the vote when he is elected. So someone like Smotrich, who's a despicable, extremist, racist, extremely dangerous person, he probably got, like, I have to know the exact percentages, but he got 6 seats out of 120 seats in the Knesset, I believe. So it's a very small minority in Israel that supports him. But unfortunately, Netanyahu put him in the coalition, and his coalition depends on him, because if he leaves, he has to find another party or others to join the coalition or face new elections. So that's why in the Israeli parliament, sometimes smaller parties have disproportionate influence, and Netanyahu is allowing them to have disproportionate influence to evade perhaps corruption charges and other charges that he faces, that he might have to go to jail to if he weren't prime minister. But I wouldn't exaggerate Smotrich's beliefs in that he represents a very small percent of Israelis, and the plurality of Israelis over and over and over again have supported two states. Under the current environment, and after the October 7th, that has decreased, but there's still, and as Dr. Sarsar has pointed out, once you get a leader, before Sadat came to Jerusalem, most Israelis objected to giving the Sinai to Egypt. Once he came to Jerusalem and they could see he was serious about peace, it flipped overnight practically to the vast majority wanting to give land for peace. So I think the circumstances can also change, but Smotrich does not represent the vast majority of Israeli opinion on this, fortunately. In terms of the flip side of Israel now, some Israelis after October 7th being even more concerned about what would happen in a Palestinian state and what would happen if Hamas was running it, since Hamas says that it wants to have, tens more October 7th if it could get it. That's an understandable fear. However, as we were trying to describe, there have been thousands of hours and thousands of pages that have come into what the two states would look like. And Yitzhak Rabin, who was a military person, said there are always risks, and there are going to be risks, but the risks of not reaching a peace agreement far outweigh the risks the risks of not having a Palestinian state alongside Israel far outweigh the risks of having one, first of all, because they are, will continue to be part of an incentive. It's not the only incentive for groups like Hamas, but part of the incentive for attacks. And you have a lot of security measures that you implement, whether it be an international peacekeeping force at the border, whether it be a demilitarized or non-militarized Palestinian state that the Palestinian negotiators seem to be agreeing to some extent in previous negotiations. There can be early warning systems. There can be all kinds of things to minimize that risk. But the risk of not having a Palestinian state, I think, outweighs the risks of having one. And of course, there are risks in everything that one undertakes.
Let me allow me. One
Sure.
of the participants is asking about the Confederation plan. I'm referring, even though I have worked with others to put together a mapping of all Confederation plans, I am party to this one. It's called the Holy Land Confederation. And you just could put my name in Google with the name Holy Land Confederation. It will give you that whole study. It's a 100-page study. And this is worked out by Israeli and Palestinian people, individuals like myself. And you are welcome to read it and see how you feel about it.
There are a couple of questions here about the Jews from Arab lands who were also expelled from their lands at the War of Independence in 1948. So people asking why they're not mentioned, and do they get a right of return? Or another one, would they be able to move immediately to the West Bank?
Okay, so yeah, I saw that. So many, I think many Americans are unaware of this. But after Israel was established in 1948, there were up to 1 million Jews who were largely forced out of the countries in the Middle East that they had lived in for hundreds of years, whether it be Libya or Iraq or Egypt or Syria or Morocco. Morocco, they weren't forced out, but in many countries, they were. And Baghdad, I think, used to be considered the New York City of Iraq, with a fourth of Baghdad being Jews, and they were all expelled. They couldn't take any property with them. They had to leave their businesses and homes. And so at times there are some people who say, well, when we negotiate Israeli-Palestinian peace, what about these people who all lost their properties and who can't return? And in fact, as Charles Tilley shows in his book, most states, unfortunately, were created through war. Their borders were created through war, and you have displacement and refugees. So I don't think it should be directly tied to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, because that's kind of a separate issue to a certain extent. But one could look not outside of those negotiations to some of these Jews who had lived in the Middle East for hundreds of years, being compensated by those countries, perhaps, or an international body for their lost properties. I think, it'd be great if some of these countries offered them a chance to return, but that's not likely necessarily in some of the countries. And right now, a lot of them are, fourth generations living in Israel and wouldn't necessarily want to go back. But that's a serious issue that also, I think, speaks to some of the stereotypes of looking at Israel as a colonialist country, or white Jews and things like that, that Americans who haven't been there might lay over it. That, of course, these are all what many Americans would consider people of color that constitute, half the Jews in Israel, or more than half the Jews in Israel. The second question is, would they move to the West Bank? I don't see why they would. The vast majority have no interest in moving to the West Bank. They live in the pre-1967 border. The vast majority of these people who were largely expelled from Middle East countries I don't think that they don't have a desire to, most of them, to move to the West Bank. So that wouldn't necessarily be a challenge in itself.
I'm in agreement. My research indicates that I'm not disagreeing with you as such. We're not talking about 1,000 or 2,000, but my understanding is that just like Palestinians during 1948 left for several reasons. One, because of the nature of war that was taking place, just like my family and I left during 1967 for a few days till things calmed down, but others were promised to leave and then have to come back. The same among Jews from Arab countries. They left for multiple reasons, but after 1948, it became impossible for them to stay, and about 800,000 to 1,000,000 left for Europe, for the United States, Canada, Australia, or for Israel itself. And I met the family, members of the family, the last Jewish family that left Libya, and they have done a film about their story, actually. And but Jews from Egypt, from Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, could not stay, and they moved to Israel or elsewhere. And I fully agree that they need to be compensated. The Palestinians, according to Resolution 194 of 1948, December 48, it says refugees have to be returned home at the soonest possible time or compensated according to international law. The same should apply to Jews from Arab countries who were forced out or who left for different reasons, and they need to be compensated for their plight at that time and since then.
About that, so I think we are getting to our witch time, but I'll put one question, and maybe people, if you two would be okay with it, people can also contact you later, maybe, or I can relay some other questions and somehow continue the conversation. But there's one question, there's a segue on the issue of the refugees, why Palestinians are the only people who are refugees for several generations and continue being, and I add maybe the role that might have in the conflict itself, and in a possible solution to it.
The question for us is why not? Why shouldn't they be compensated? There is already a resolution approved by the United Nations that I mentioned, December 1948, which recognizes them, accords them rights, and all refugees, whether they happen to be Palestinian, Jews from Arab countries, Syrian refugees in Lebanon or Jordan, all of them have to be allowed to return home or be compensated for their experience. We need to rise above this nationalistic way of saying, I'm right, and never mind, they have enough to live on, let them disappear from existence. It just doesn't work. Every human life counts, every human right has to count, whether it applies to us or it applies to others. And we need to change the way we view the world, the way we view conflict. And we have been playing zero-sum games. We need to start playing non-zero-sum games where we reach out to each other and defend each other's rights. And there are countries that are ready and willing to compensate those refugees. Why not resolve their issues? And the refugees who are in Gaza or in the West Bank, in Jordan, elsewhere, have to see a political horizon, a vision for a better tomorrow. Otherwise, the conflict will fester on and on and on for decades, and enough is enough. No Israeli wishes this on anybody. No sane Israeli wishes on this. No Palestinian sane person needs to impose this on others. This is we need to figure out better ways of coexistence, of cohabitation. And we are missing the boat on and on. And it's a pity, and I'm concluding here, it's a pity that we focus on the next election. We need to create a way by which peacemakers and peace builders work together and meet in the middle to advance peace for everybody. Otherwise, we'll lose other opportunities day in, day out.
We are at time. I don't know if we take another one or we stop here, and let me try to save this so I can.
Yeah, I would rather maybe if we take a couple questions here, rather I find it very difficult over email to get into discussions. It's a little harder unless someone just wants book suggestions or something like that. So I'd rather just do it now if we're going to answer some questions. But
Okay, so well, there's several here.
We'll have another webinar.
Well, we certainly will. I mean, at some point we have many opportunities, and unfortunately, the reality kind of forces us to continue discussing that and trying to find a reasonable solution. So we'll have opportunities to discuss more. But okay, so Britain didn't let Jews into Palestine because of Arab pressure and the Great Arab Revolt of 36 to 39, right? Okay, we talked about the Confederation. Already talked about Smotrich. Sorry, people. There is a question about divestment, whether, like, how do you see the role of divestment in this work toward peace?
do you want to address that, Saliba, or do you know?
I understand each of us, Jewish, Palestinian, Israeli, each of us has certain gifts to bring to the world, certain emphasis we bring to the world. And we feel differently about things. From my perspective, my both lived experience and my research, I'm in favor of dialogue, of reaching out to the other, of reconciling with the other, of using my beliefs and my values to advance peace. And I'm not saying I'm unique, because there are millions of people who feel the same way, and they need to express it in their own way. I express it through my writings, my speaking, my poetry. And Israelis and Palestinians who are in this category should really express it, because what we are witnessing is the extreme voice being sounding high. We need the overwhelming majority who are for peace to stand together and say enough is enough. We will not tolerate it. We want to advance our common future together. And that's what I tried to express in my poem. So within this context, divestment, boycotting, and so on has no place, because it will be unnecessary. Now, how do we bring change? The voters in Israel and in Palestine have to speak up. And if they wish for peace, they need to elect leaders who stand for peace. And that is my way of approaching it, as opposed to saying in a nationalist way, they are wrong and we are right. They better do it this way or nothing. I'm not that type of advocate. I am advocating for peace so that both peoples come to common ground and establish a better world for themselves and for their children and grandchildren.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, this is especially the case for academic boycotts, that we want to be able to hear different perspectives from Palestinians and Israelis. We want to, you know, the vast majority of Israeli academics don't support what the government policies are for. Often a two-state solution, have voted for those kind of parties, as are many academics in the U.S. And other parts of the world. And so you don't want to block out people that are actually working in their own countries to further peace in different ways. And we also want to be able to, especially at universities, have academic freedom, try to understand different perspectives, be able to do that through classes, through exchanges, through interactions with different universities. And as Dr. Sarsar said, there are in many of the Israeli universities a higher percentage of Palestinian students who are Israeli citizens. 21% of Israeli citizens in the 67 borders are Palestinian, and now we have a president at the University of Haifa, even though there's definitely a long way to improvement as well in terms of equality in the country. And so the whole point of academia is to be able to understand other countries, to study them, and otherwise we would have large parts of the world where we wouldn't be able to study abroad, where we wouldn't be able to interact with, where we wouldn't be able to hear from their scholars. So definitely that's what academia is all about. And I think in the past there were about 280 presidents of American universities who, for those reasons, came out against academic boycotts. And so I think both Dr. Sarsar and I are very much for dialogue. In fact, I would recommend his book on peace building, where he looks at, I think, 150 Israeli-Palestinian peace building organizations and how they're working together. And those groups are often ones we don't hear about, how they're working together to create a better future. And so we don't want to cut those things off, but actually strengthen them.
Thank you. We are at 41. So 10 minutes after, 11 minutes after the time. So I think I'm going to call it, to respect, to honor, you know, the time of both the speakers and our public who planned for that. So again, I would like to thank all those who came tonight, who are here, and I hope you continue the conversation and bring that this conversation to campus and to the surroundings everywhere. I want to thank Dr. Sarsar and Dr. Aronoff for being here and for engaging us with your work and your thoughts. So we will certainly have chances to continue, for better or worse, but anyway.
For better.
For better, hopefully for better, right. We need positive thinking, right. So again, thank you and good night to everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Yael. Thank you, Monique.
Thank you to everyone, and with real wishes for peace. All right.
Thank you.